Okay, I think we might get started now. Just before I start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people upon whose lands I currently live and work, and that sovereignty was never ceded. My name is Dr. Renee Fomiati and I'm a Research Officer at ARCSHS, and I'd like to welcome you to the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society's Research and Practice Seminar Series. This month we have Dr. Finn Mackay joining us to speak about contemporary butch lesbian identity in the context of the UK gender wars. Finn is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of the West England in Bristol. Finn is also the author of Radical Feminism, Activism in Movement from Palgrave, and the forthcoming book, Female Masculinities and the Gender Wars from Bloomsbury. So Finn's going to speak for about 40 minutes, followed by question time afterwards. I'd encourage everyone to raise your virtual hand at that time and I can switch on your mic so you can ask questions, or please feel free to submit a question via the chat function. Finn, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all of you there. I believe your sun is just going down and my sun is just rising here, but hopefully not coming in through the window and reflecting too much on the screen. Thank you very much for inviting me. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some research that I did on female queer masculinities in the UK. And some of the quotes that I'll use in this presentation are taken from that data that I gathered from this survey that I did quite a while ago now, it feels, in 2017, over 200 responses. And within that, about 40 participants identified as butch lesbian, butch dyke, or a butch identity of some sort. There was lots of different identities that, that people chose. Most of the survey was open text, so people were allowed obviously to spell out and explain a bit more about how they identified their gender. The most common response, so most of the participants were white British or white European, which is a weakness of the data. Another weakness of the sample was that the majority of respondents were over 35. And so it misses out this younger generation that we hear a lot of research about, and this generational shift, you know, that we read about that's going on in terms of change in language for things like sex, gender, and sexuality identities. So I'm going to be talking to you today using some actual voices from that data, from butch lesbians, also people that are kind of making a home for themselves in between identities. And that was one of my particular research interests. So people that are between maybe binary identities or shift between identities. So I was interested how the sort of new terms that are emerging are affecting maybe what might be seen as older identities like butch, but then how that also is being changed by the emergence of these new terms and how people are making that term their own, or indeed moving away from it, and if so, why? So, and you can see there as well, I've got the cover there of this book from Dr. Morris, The Disappearing L. So there is a concern, that book is looking at American spaces, but there is a concern that lesbian spaces, in particular, lesbian communities are in decline and have been so since, maybe since the 1990s, at least here in Britain and in the US. And there's a concern that as those lesbian communities are decreasing, there are less lesbian role models, and we get these familiar narratives about what's called butch flight. So this concern that younger masculine lesbian people or same-sex orientated people will not see role models, will not see communities that they can be part of, and so are less likely to take up those identities. Another reason that I wanted to do this research, and that obviously I'll talk about today as well, is the context of the so-called gender wars. Now, I know that around the world, the UK is sort of seen as uniquely sort of at the forefront of these gender wars, or kind of uniquely transphobic. I don't think that is particularly the case, but there is quite a strong gender critical movement here for different reasons, and I'll touch on that in this presentation, and we can maybe come back to it in the questions. But within that context of the gender wars, this figure of the masculine, female at birth person, or female bodied person, or butch lesbian, is often being weaponized in these gender wars. People are using that figure, usually people not from the queer community at all, but from outside it, who are using this figure of queer female masculine people to say, oh, look, there's a threat, there's a danger, these people are going to be transed, they're going to be brainwashed by the trans lobby and all these different terms. So a niche identity that we don't hear much about is being brought into the mainstream, but for this reason, to play this role in the gender wars, and mainly to attack the rights of trans people and try to limit the rights of trans people. As I said, there's also this generational shift. So this is interesting. We've got this, you know, emergence of a whole load of new terms. Younger people are less likely to use fixed terms for their sex, gender, and sexuality identities. They're more likely to use sex neutral and gender neutral pronouns. So something is clearly going on. Categories that were seen as fixed are now seen as more fluid. They're seen as up for debate. What will this mean for previous terms, like that of butch lesbian, for example, and how is it going to be changed by these increasing new terms? Here in the UK, the gender wars, we can't separate these from the wider culture wars that are going on in the UK at the moment and are being whipped up and used by our Conservative government as well, to create scapegoats for social problems that they have created, as well as to distract from the brutal consequences of those social problems that they have created. So unfortunately, there has been, you know, a move to more open expression of prejudice, extreme right wing and racism that hadn't gone away, but perhaps didn't speak so boldly and is now being emboldened. So, you know, we have things like Murdoch is bringing a new news channel here called GB News. We had political parties standing in mayoral and council elections called things like Reclaim. We had the Brexit, you know, party. The Conservative government wants to stop schools. Lives Matter. Allow curriculums to address the equality minister for the businesses talking about implicit bias or white privilege, for example. Within the Students' Union, they've set up a new champion of free speech, and they openly use language saying that this is all a war against woke and a war against wokeness. And the gender wars are a part of that, so they're a part of something much bigger. I've just put in there some of the headlines just so you can see what I'm talking about. You know, these are everywhere. Some of these are from Telegraph, Sunday Times, sort of mainstream broadsheets here in the UK, right-leaning. Trans extremists putting equality at risk. Children sacrificed to appease the trans lobby. Calls to end transgender experiment on children. So you can see these are quite alarmist and inflammatory headlines that we're dealing with. Often all of this, of course, is reduced in the media to this battle that pits feminists on one side and trans women on the other side. And of course, one school of feminism in particular gets singled out, and that is radical feminism. And as a scholar of radical feminism and radical feminist theory, I would say that is wrong. And this label TERF, meaning trans exclusionary radical feminist, is now being used for any trans exclusionary or transphobic views. And it has almost become a meaningless term, because most of those people in power, with the power to limit trans people's lives even more and to attack trans people's lives even more, those people are not feminists. They're certainly not radical feminists. So I think that's unfortunate, and it also kind of misses out a legacy of what we might now call queer theory from radical feminism, and some very kind of prescient theory on the fluidity and deconstruction of sex and gender from radical feminists of the second wave. You can see there a Mail headline from Daily Mail that I've got on the slide there. Teachers told not to push tomboys to change their gender just because of the way they like to dress or play. So this is an indication as well of what I said earlier, this figure of the masculine female, the tomboy or the butch lesbian being used in these culture wars and being sort of weaponized as this potential victim of this, you know, mysterious trans lobby. The term TERF and its roots actually come from the early 2000s, from a feminist site, a website that was discussing, discussing radical feminist theory. And on there, this acronym was used. Now, the reason the acronym was used, TERF, was to make a distinction between radical feminists that were organising with trans women and radical feminists who weren't and who were politically opposed to doing so. And now, the very reason then for that term to have emerged is now pretty much lost, because it's become this meaningless kind of generic term. But what we know from this, what we can learn from this, is that there is no one, universal generic position within radical feminism. Radical feminism is not innately transphobic or anti-trans inclusion. There were always differing views, and in fact that's why this distinguishing acronym had to emerge in the first place. I've mentioned that already. We get these, this generational shift. There's been research here in UK schools finding over 23 different terms in use in UK schools amongst pupils for gender identity. This was seen as a sort of vanguardist position by those young students in schools. It was seen as progressive. They saw themselves as leading this generational shift. So then, within this shift, how is this going to affect these, categories that have been around for longer? And when I say, what's going to happen to this category of butch in the post-trans landscape, I don't mean by that use of the word post to suggest that trans rights are now one, that we have trans visibility and inclusion and it's all fine. I don't mean post in that way. I mean post the so-called trans tipping point, that was on the cover of Time magazine. There is increased visibility of this social movement, and so that's what I mean. I mean post this increased visibility and public attention on the social movement for trans rights. As I said, some people within lesbian communities are concerned that these shifts to new terms are going to kind of eclipse older identities, and you can see this in some of the quotes there. Today in the queer community, we're more likely to hear the term boys. Butches had a heyday and then disappeared, and now they're disappearing again. Ivan Coyote saying, what would people call themselves? They have called themselves, 30 years ago. Would that be different now? Professor Jack Halberstam, of course, is one of the few people who has continued to write about butch identity, butch lesbian identity, and sort of transgender butch identity as well, and has looked at these sort of waves of public attention, around the sort of lesbian chic time of the 90s, and then when you saw so-called kind of butch figures come into the media. Okay, so what does butch mean anyway? There is no agreed label. I'm using that term here, but you can see in the quote there, attempting to define this term is one of the surest ways to get volatile discussion among lesbians. Here's Rubin saying, I will argue the simplest definition of butch is the most helpful, a category of lesbian gender. And that's interesting, and that's what a lot of my participants picked up as well. Many saw butch as a distinct gender identity in itself, but is constituted through the deployment and manipulation of masculine gender codes and symbols within one's culture, so recognizable codes and symbols. And that is what a lot of my participants said. Masculine woman, and then some kind of bit more esoteric as well. It's a state of mind. It speaks to appearance. masculine clothing, the way we hold our bodies, a lesbian who is more stereotypically masculine than feminine. It goes beyond the exterior. Butchness is important. And then language about as well how it's empowering, and it's an empowering identity, and it's a way of getting through the kind of hostility that looking different can bring. All of this, of course, is raced and classed. So several of my participants, and you see this reflected in the literature as well, said that with the emergence of all these different new terms to describe female-bodied or queer masculinities, yes, maybe there had been a bit of a decrease in the use of the word butch, but some of my participants said that has mainly been amongst white queer communities, and actually in black queer communities, it is still used quite a lot, and there has not been that same decrease. As I say, that's discussed in the literature, and it was fed back by my participants as well. Now you can see there, Cole, who started the Brown Boy Project and coined this term mock or masculine of centre to make a more inclusive term for AFAB or female-bodied queer people who had a masculine gender identity. So this term mock, which is now quite popular and quite well used, is there saying in that quote, again pointing this out, that these terms are still used, masculine gender identities are common, are respected, are understood, and yet out there in the media, the image we see of queer female masculinity or butch masculinity tends to be very much a white and urban representation. It was also classed. Again, this was picked up by my participants, with participants talking about the association of this term butch with its kind of popular origin story. So the popular origin story, as we all know, and the origin that gets the most press is from urban working class bar culture of America in the 1950s. That's not the only story, as is always the case with origin stories, but perhaps as well because of the kind of cultural imperialism of America, and that America is the king of cool. You know, when we see representations of that, of the history, that does tend to be what it is, white and urban. And its associations with working class bar culture, people talked about how awareness of those stories meant that they sometimes felt they couldn't claim that identity for themselves because maybe they weren't working class, they didn't feel that they were in working class occupations, and so they felt that they were, you know, making claim to something that they shouldn't. And you can see that in the response from one of my participants here. Very educated, I dress like a posh guy, butch aesthetics seem more working class. So they said, maybe I should call myself dapper. Lots of participants, although they talked about masculinity and recognizable codes within their culture of masculinity that people then recognized in them and in their expression, they didn't use that term masculinity, you know, untroubled or without question. So they critiqued dominant, or what we might call hegemonic masculinities, and many of them said, I don't really like hegemonic masculinity. I don't like a lot of what masculinity is supposed to mean. And so they talked about the inherent contradictions of that. Always identified as masculine, but not with dominant masculinities. Masculinity is about privilege. And again, people reflected on that. It's the privilege I get moving through the world. No catcalls, no refusal at gay venues, no give us a smile shouted in the street. I'm most definitely not male, and actually I don't much like a lot of heterosexual men, said somebody. A lot of people talked about the aesthetics of masculinity. So the importance of stereotypically kind of observable and understood and readable masculine clothing. It doesn't have to do with men, people said. It can be about aesthetics, it can be about expression, someone who is comfortable in more masculine clothing. It's to do with a look rather than anything else, and the bravery needed to wear it, dressing in a masculine style. Who are butches, masculine dressing lesbians with short hair. This was somebody who didn't identify as butch themselves, was commenting on this. Older, generally larger women who have a presence, like the woman version of a bear with tattoos and wears leather jackets and hard-looking clothing. There were a lot of stereotypical terms that we would associate with masculinity as well that did come out, unsurprisingly, because nobody lives in a vacuum, in this feedback that participants gave. So using terms like rough presentations, hard looks, hard clothing, things that we would expect really to come out when you're talking about masculinity. Also, the embodiment of masculinity, it's about physical presentation, it's about certain styles, avoiding curves, not accentuating curves, emphasizing flatness and straightness, differing degrees of manliness. It can mean anatomical, but also behavioral differences. It's a social construct, and again, people talked about this. So there's this contradiction again, understanding that it's a social construct, but still living gender and feeling gender as innate sometimes and as a core part of their identity. Now, sometimes people talk explicitly about embodiment and sex characteristics of the body. And you can see there, you know, what is masculinity? Some days this person is saying they wish they had a penis, they wish they were flat-chested, but still society, masculine can mean anything from just men's clothes, activities, roles, colours, have a gender identity. Somebody says as well, if I had a male body, I'd probably be seen as camp and I would work at looking camp, whereas stereotypical masculinity is looking tough, building muscle, talking loud, trying to take control. You can see there again, as I mentioned earlier, these stereotypical words that we know are attached to masculinity coming through in the feedback that participants gave. Styling and body shape, a muscular physique. There's loads of debate, isn't there, about gender identity and what it is, where it comes from, when it forms. You know, we can go back to Stoller and the kind of quite dodgy sort of classic, more behaviorist and psychological narratives about gender identity forming, you know, in children by the age of 4, being policed in other people, in other children, you know, by around 6 and 7. Where does it come from? Comes from society, or, you know, is it related to something that people are born with? This whole kind of born this way or not discussion goes on and on, doesn't it, really? But some people, they did feel that their gender was part of them. They did feel it was an essence. Masculinity describes an essence, the core of me, a masculine center. It goes way beyond the exterior. It's about how I feel about myself and in myself, how I hold my body and how my inside carries the outside. Now, Levitt and Horn, American psychologists, have also done a lot of research on butch lesbian communities in the US. And their research also found participants talking about an early sense of an affinity with a certain gender, available gender, and not another. So as we live in a binary, most people live in a binary context, they preferred one or felt innately drawn to one over the other. So gender identity, even if we can kind of stand back academically and deconstruct it and look at it as the social construction, many people were saying, yes, I can trouble it, I can critique it, I understand all that, but I still experience it and feel it as if it is innate, as if it is real and real to me, okay? This is Sally Munt, who's a British academic who has done work on butch and femme lesbian gender as well, critiquing this idea about voluntarism and saying we shouldn't overclaim, you know, we need to not go too far and suggest that people can just sort of pick up and put on or take off expressions, you know, at will, because where we will head with that is people saying, oh, well, it's just a superficial identity. It's just about how you present. If we popularize that framing of it, then of course people can turn around and say, well, why don't you just take it off? Why don't you just take that presentation off? You know, if you're getting hassle in the street, if you're having trouble at job interviews, just be a different way, just present a different way. So yeah, that quote is saying we shouldn't go too far that way. Even if we can understand identities as socially constructed, they are still lived realities for people. This is Levitt and Highstand this time. They're also that pair of researchers again have looked at butch identity. The women had an internal sense of gender they experienced as essential. They were conscious that naming this gender as butch, however, it was all a social construction, okay? As they say there in the quote, many of the participants had an early and strong sense of gender that was experienced as though it is biological in nature, and it drove participants to maintain and express gender differences, even in the face of great discrimination out there in the world. A lot of participants made this distinction between masculinity generally and then female masculinity as a type of masculinity in itself. And people were saying, well, we might talk about gay masculinity or urban masculinity or young masculinity. Why can't we talk about female masculinity in the same way and have that be seen as its own kind of gender expression? So how did people express that? Again, there was just links to sort of recognizable masculinity. Female person presenting in a masculine way. I can't use typical here because what I've learned is that most butches or studs are atypical. There is no one way to do butch. Butch is a lesbian who is masculine of centre, but there is a spectrum of how masculine they may present. It's an identity not just based on clothing, but on feelings of masculinity, masculine mannerisms and dress. And here's somebody else saying, a woman or non-gender binary person who identifies with presentation and behaviour normally associated with masculinity, but does not desire to be a male. It is also a statement of rejection of the cis hetero male gaze. A lot of participants did talk about experiencing hostility, experiencing prejudice out there in the world. And many people talked about being misread. But then there was this interesting distinction between whether sex or gender was being misread. So we're kind of familiar with this term about misgendering. But for a lot of my participants in the communities that I'm interested in, it's actually missexing, which doesn't sound as good and is harder to say. But a lot of these cases were missexing. So gender expression and identification was being seen correctly and read correctly as masculine. But of course, because of these limited couplings that we have, these kind of triads that are out there in society, you know, that it's assumed male equals masculine and heterosexual, female equals feminine and heterosexual. Because of the primacy of those understandings, when someone is correctly read as masculine, they are then incorrectly assumed to be male rather than female. So the gender can be seen and read correctly, the sex can then be assumed wrongly. People think I am female, but I present in a masculine way. People do not recognize butch as a gender identity. Where was this a problem? So it was a problem in toilets. It was a problem out there in the world in public toilets. And I would say most of my participants said, yes, they get hassle in women's toilets. The greatest irritation is having to deal with other women in public toilets who every time I go there are shocked at my being there. In women's toilets, I get double glances. I have been mistaken for a man in gay clubs when younger, mistaken for a gay man. Public toilets are entertaining to me and how other people get confused. Men have followed me into the ladies, then found a lack of urinals, women assuming they're in the wrong toilet and leave. Usually no aggression, only confusion. My gender identity is always mistaken, causing anxiety in others. No public toilets for me, said somebody. So because of kind of being assumed to be in the wrong place and spaces that we're increasingly within the gender wars being told are some sort of kind of safe spaces for women, because women or female people did not feel safe there and actually experienced hostility in those places, some people did not feel that woman was a category that they resonated with or felt part of. And you can see there in some of this feedback, somebody saying, I have a female body, I birthed a child, I'm a feminist, but I can't help feeling deeply alienated from the category of woman itself. I'm often misgendered, it pisses me off, I defend my womanhood aggressively. Being a woman covers all kinds of identities, but I understand why some people misgender me. I am uncomfortable when addressed as a lady, often able to pass as sir, which I prefer. Female pronouns and titles don't fit for me. I have the empathy of growing up female, but a different mentality in adult masculinity. So yeah, some people, they didn't identify as a woman or with womanhood. And this extended as well then to a lesbian identity. So some people didn't identify or resonate either with the category of lesbian. It was seen as a clearly sexed identity, a very female identity. It has a history, you know, going back to the kind of, it's associated with sort of 19 ideas of the second wave and stereotypical ideas of lesbian feminism. It's complicated. I feel like the rejection of lesbian for other categories is maybe internalized homophobia. I'm not afraid of the term, I just don't identify with it. I sometimes find the word lesbian hard to hear. It's been used in a derogatory manner. I tend to say gay woman. It's important to keep the identity of lesbian from a political standpoint, as there's certain structural issues that affect lesbians and not all queer people. I don't much like the word lesbian. Is it internalized homophobia? Somebody said, I'm butch, which to me is not lesbian. My experience is that lesbians are generally intolerant of the butch-femme dynamic and can be rigid and annoying, and I am not them. I prefer queer or dyke. Lesbian is too female for my liking. So what was being raised there was kind of traditional and long-standing fault lines within feminism. These, of course, are the fault lines around lesbian feminist theory and lesbian feminist critiques of butch femme sexuality as aping heterosexual gender norms, as oppressive, as sexist, and the kind of lesbian feminist critiques that we saw of butch femme dynamics in the second wave. People are aware of that. They're aware of what in the UK and the US is called the Lesbian Sex Wars. And so they feel that maybe lesbians generally don't understand butch femme dynamics. So this distinction was made between female and woman. That was people talking about their embodied characteristics, their sexed characteristics, and also socialization from their early years. Politically, I feel like a woman because I've been socialized as one. I identify with female, which is biological, but much less with woman, which is a social construct. There's no space for people like me for my presentation. Some people said they thought that being a butch lesbian was a type of womanhood, but it wasn't seen as such. I found it hard to identify as a woman for a while. I felt excluded from women's spaces from being butch, and awkwardness around my butch body. Anatomically, I'm female, grown up as a woman with the implications that has. I have no objection to that matter of fact being asserted, and butchness is one way of describing what type of woman I am. So there was then this distinction between people would claim categories like woman and lesbian politically. They would say, yes, I had issues with it. I'm not sure I resonate with it. I'm not sure it fits for me, but I use these terms politically. I feel a political commitment to womanhood. I don't want to distance myself. Politically, it's important for me to identify as a woman, but I'm not overly attached to being misgendered. The femaleness of my body isn't something I'm attached to or is very important to me. It's a category which is applied to me and captures the inequalities of my life. I identify with it insofar as I identify with my oppression and its use today. So politically a woman, but not feeling a kind of internal resonance or belonging or home there, but understanding the political importance of using that term and being, under that banner or category. Many people talked about a lack of female masculine role models out there, that it wasn't being seen as an option, and also that sometimes some people did feel that there was a focus or an increasing focus in the mainstream on transgender masculinity, trans men, transmasculinity, and that the people that were being missed out were the female-bodied queer masculine people. So there you can see someone saying it's important terms are distinguished. Not every butch should be viewed as FTM or non-binary. Not helpful that trans women dominate the conversation. Transmasculinity is invisible in the media. There's new words and ways of expressing gender, but there's still not many out butchers or studs out there, and tomboys in the media are so rare. Some people were concerned that these new terms were going to eclipse terms like butch. People said that butch was seen as old school and out of date in some cases. Gender is being described variously more than ever. There's more options to choose from, but butch is perceived more negatively now. The growth of new labels are eroding other groups of women. Butch dyke as a descriptor seems to have become something that many women don't want to be called. Maybe the new words sound cooler. Queer and gay have consumed other identities, and words like femme has been mainstreamed for feminine wrongly, and this in turn reduces butch categories further. The rise in fluid identities gives people more choice. I think butch is seen by some as old-fashioned or traditional, when it absolutely isn't. It's varied, diverse, and unique. Butch flight was raised as a concern. This whole idea of border wars has become a cliche now, you know, mainly studied from the sort of queer 1990s between trans men and butch lesbians or transmasculine people and female-bodied butch people. So yes, it was a concern. And, you know, when I was writing all this up, I didn't want to play that down. I wanted to be honest about what people were feeding back to me. I was so proud of identifying as butch in my early 20s, but now butch is seen as old-fashioned and not as cutting edge as being trans or genderqueer. So now I don't have those discussions and I distance myself, and gender identity in some senses has become harder to talk about. There was a sense butches might become or already be an endangered species. Coming out as a lesbian brought me into a community which celebrates butchness. We are an endangered species, after all, said one butch dyke. The term butch was seen as implicitly sexed as female, and some people thought that was maybe what would put people off it, or mean that people couldn't take on that term for themselves if they had discomfort around that. So butch and mock are similar, don't imply that you don't identify with the term woman, which newer terms do. Butch relates to women, the others don't. People mistake a butch for one of these other identities. Here's somebody saying, this was raised a lot as well, people assume you must be en route to transitioning to become a trans man, even when people were not taking on that identity. Any gender expression should be a choice and respected. Somebody says they don't want to be trans, but they feel butch is not accepted or respected by the queer or straight world. It's always easier to have a name for things, isn't it? And so people felt it was harder to explain themselves when they didn't fit into the assumptions that people had. I'm often mistaken for a man. I hear people saying, is that a man or a woman? I've been asked if I'm trans, which makes me unhappy as it's taking a step back to what others think you should look like. Many people I assume I am trans rather than a masculine woman. There are intersections with the new terms, but there is also a fear that butch disappears in all of the above. So some people felt that other newer identities were more understood and more accepted, and butch was seen as out of date and wasn't really seen like a real identity, and people didn't really understand it. People also felt, because of this focus on transgender and transmasculine identities in the culture and in the media, that butch became seen as even more surface, as even more superficial. You know, within this neoliberal context where we were encouraged to see ourselves as a work in progress, you know, like some sort of walking CV, we're encouraged to find our real self, our inner self, and then disclose that publicly and have validation for this journey, which is generally seen as an A to B sort of journey. That's how it's understood, going from one category to another category. Lots of people are living between categories, moving between them, or making a mixture of categories for themselves. A lot of that brings hostility, it brings prejudice. It is hard to do. It can be a tough life story, but people felt that wasn't seen because it wasn't seen as real an identity. So as you can see there, the new terms have a lot in common, but these new prefixes like trans suggest something beyond the presentation of self and body and speak to something more fundamental. We've been taught to think of trans as a buzzword now, which comes with a whole accompanying narrative of tragedy, identity struggle, existential crisis, A lot of people might see butch as something surface level, performed, and maybe even transient, taking place against the female body with no accompanying identity crisis. So people were saying, no one takes this identity seriously. They don't think that we have been on a journey, or maybe still are. They don't think that we have to wrestle with things or receive hostility for staking a claim to a particular identity, because it isn't so clear and it isn't so recognized. And then people think it's not as real, it's not as deep, it's not as meaningful. Okay, I think I'm on time miraculously, and I've raced through that and bombarded you with loads of information. So now, yeah, happy to hear from you and discuss or take questions.
Oh, thank you so much. You did. I was just at the end just thinking about the kind of the nuanced and just such expansive kind of complexities in trying to navigate all this stuff. So you did a great job. I can see that Karen has put a question into the bottom, into the chat function. Karen, I'm going to allow you to talk just in case you want to read out your question yourself, but I'm also happy to do it.
Sure. I'm glad my video is not on because I'm in my pajamas.
Oh, great.
Well, it's the end of the working day for us. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Finn. So I'm really interested in the distinctions between the kind of identity formation that you talked about from the 1950s onwards with the butch femme kind of aesthetic, as it kind of derived from bar culture. And, you know, the UK and the US has had a very different type of lesbian bar culture than Australia has. And so I was thinking about, I guess, the relationship of the types of identity formation and contradictions and complexity as they relate to the changing spaces that exist. So, I mean, you might be familiar with Rebecca Jennings' work that looked at lesbian socialising in Sydney up until the end of 1970s. A colleague of mine, Sophie Robinson, has looked at the 70s and 80s, and I've sort of been looking at the 1990s onwards. And I think we're all in agreement that there's never sort of been a very stable lesbian bar culture in Australia. Just wondering how that feeds into, or what your perspective is on the relationship of space and identity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of differences as well between the sort of lesbian and gay spaces in the UK in the 40s, 50s and 60s as well compared to the US. So there's some British histories that suggest the class distinction was not so present. But then if you look at British publications from those times, like Arena 3, the Minorities Research Group, you see actually conversations about class playing out and people kind of understanding what certain places represent in terms of class. And there was also a kind of private house party scene as well, which was seen as utilised more by middle class people. So there's different points of view on that about the UK, but it is seen in some ways as being different to the US. My participants in the research, they did talk about women's spaces. Some had a background in feminist activism and lesbian feminist spaces. Some worked in the women's sector. So when they talked about lesbian spaces, when they talked about that, they were often talking more about conflict and borders in those spaces. That was really the main reason that they invoked them. People that worked in the women's sector talked about, interestingly talked about sometimes feeling guilty or almost kind of fraudulent or kind of hyper-conscious about their masculine presentation. So some people said, oh, I work with mainly women, or I work in the women's sector. I'm really conscious not to talk too much, not to talk over people. I don't like being on the front desk or in a public-facing role because people are not sure what I am. I don't want to make other women feel uncomfortable. So yeah, I think mostly when lesbian spaces and women's spaces were talked about, it was from this concern with how they fitted into that and how they would be seen in that, and an awareness of these kind of insider debates that mainly move around these feminist fault lines around which school of feminism somebody comes from, and the quite specific views of lesbian feminism on lesbian sexuality and butch femme sexuality in particular. And even if people weren't aware of that in depth, they had received that wisdom that there were these border wars within lesbianism, that not everyone felt the same way, that some people might be hostile to them. So yeah, unfortunately,
Absolutely,
it was mainly, yeah, talked about negatively. And some people said they explicitly sought out queer spaces because of that. They had moved to more mixed spaces because they didn't have to worry about watching themselves or being aware of challenge.
Look, I think that's really fascinating, and for something that I just think is incredible is that those same conclusions are drawn about this contested space in these different sites that have really different kind of commercial trajectories and commercial histories. So I think, yeah, that's super, super interesting. And it's reflected in some of the findings that we've got here in Australia as well.
I can see that Nicole has their hand up, so I'm going to allow them to talk, and then we've got a question in the chat from Ivy, who I'll go to next.
Hello, I'm also glad you can't see my video because I'm listening to your fabulous presentation while I'm cooking, so thank you. Thank you, Finn, that was awesome. My research is on what I call gendered hate speech, which is predominantly hate speech directed towards women, and trying to be as inclusive as possible has, it really is leading me to question the category of women, but also, you know, what is gender? But just leaving that to the side, I'd just be interested to hear your comments. So when Elliot Page came out, I don't know, a couple of months ago, or I can't remember how long it was ago, there was a lot of commentary almost straight away about some lesbians saying publicly that they were disappointed that they'd lost a lesbian from the mix. And, you know, that was immediately jumped on as being transphobic, and I'm sure some of it really was genuinely transphobic. But what's your thought around that kind of discussion and those types of comments, and how, you know, it's immediately assumed to be transphobic and those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that, participants did bring that out. Trying to find it now. Yeah, so you can see there in that quote from Beeman and Eliasson, sense of invisibility needs to be acknowledged, as does their fear that they are disappearing in a world where butch lesbians are transitioning to trans men, male identities. Because I think because feminism as a social movement is so simplified and so misunderstood, there isn't a wide public understanding of the different schools of feminism and the different approaches that they take. So reactions like that around Elliot Page often get reduced to being seen as TERF responses. And people will say, oh, it's creepy, you know, they don't want lesbian, they want to keep lesbians to themselves. People will kind of sexualize it and say, oh, it's creepy, they want to keep these people to themselves so they have access to them. They don't want them leaving the lesbian pool, as if it's like leaving a dating pool. I don't think that is always the case. As you say, of course it might be, but I think it's just true that lesbian spaces, you know, as your previous colleague said, in Australia as well, have always been precarious, have always been, you know, temporary, trying to make the rent, you know, having to move around, have been affected in the UK by this increasing consumerism of the high street and the nighttime economy, so they just can't afford to be there. They have definitely declined. That has happened quite quickly. So people forget as well that, you know, lesbian spaces of the, from the 80s, 90s, those people are still around. It's not history. It's not something that's in an archive. Those people are still around. They can remember going to regular lesbian discos, lesbian clubs, lesbian bars. And now, relatively quickly, they're all not there. We've also got this reduction of different feminist views. I mean, I don't agree with lesbian feminist views on, on trans inclusion. But I see it as a lesbian feminist view. I wouldn't say, oh, that's what all feminists think, or, oh, well, that's just all generally a TERF kind of opinion. So I think a lot of people feel misunderstood and misrepresented, and it is invoking older debates and concerns about, of course, what was called butch flight. And interestingly on that, I think the distinction isn't, some people had gone the other way. So some people had a flight path that they had started off identifying as non-binary, and then they had actually come to a butch identity and said, oh no, actually, butch is quite expansive. It's got a real nice history. I feel I resonate with it now. So some people had a flight path that went the other way, but you never hear about those people. And of course, maybe butch flight isn't butch flight. It's trans man flight, or it's transgender flight. It's people who now have a range of identities available and understood, so they can pick one, they can use one that they feel has always explained how they are, but the language just maybe wasn't out there. So there's a lot going on. I definitely don't agree with kind of shutting things down as TERF views or TERF perspectives. But I think we're talking about different things. Is there an issue about the misrepresentation and underrepresentation of lesbians? Is there a misunderstanding and hostility towards feminism as a movement because there is hostility towards women as a group? Yes. Has there been a concerted attack on lesbian spaces as well as queer spaces in general, making it impossible for them to exist in an increasingly commodified consumerist public space? Yes. And those are all really important issues that we need to talk about and don't get talked about. So then people feel when they do get a route in around something like a high profile lesbian person coming out as something else, people feel, oh, I can get a route in now and talk about what I want to talk about. So I think the issues are real, but they're different. So I think actually we need to talk more about those other issues rather than closing them down, because we're sort of playing in to these gender wars.
Thank you. That's such a well thought out response. Thank you, Finn.
Thank you. It's the morning for me and I've only had one coffee, so thank you.
You're doing so well. The hairs on my arms, I felt moved just then when you were speaking. That was great, Finn. I'm gonna, Ivy, I have unmuted you or invited you to speak or whatever the phrase is, but I'm also happy to read it out, and I'll go ahead and unless you start speaking. Ivy says, amazing, thanks so much. She wishes we could all have drinks afterwards. So do I, although it's a bit early in the morning for you, Finn. Ivy, I'd like to know your take on this from your research participants and your readings. There's often a lot of talk about the queer youth of today being very fluid and even unmatched or unattached to gender labels, or even moving beyond gender labels. I wonder if compared to the late 20th century, identifying with a gendered label is more important now or less.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think for my participants, identifying and expressing their gender identity and what some people saw as their lesbian gender identity was still really important to them. But they felt that in society in general, there was definitely a shift to a more fluid and unlabeled identity. And this has been going on for a long time. There's more public awareness around it now, but research for a long time has been suggesting that younger people don't even want to tick a box. They don't want to be boxed. They will identify as not straight. They will want to use different pronouns. So something is definitely afoot. There is a generational shift. Categories that were previously presumed to be fairly fixed are now seen as influx, as a movable feast, as up for debate. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. But I think because a lot of my participants felt that their particular gender identity or lesbian gender identity was not recognised and was not represented, it became more important to them to express it and make it clear to people. So because they did feel that, exactly as you say, there is this shift to more fluid identities, absolutely. And they saw that happening and they wondered where they would fit into it.
All right, we've maybe got time for one more question. Sorry, Ivy, I didn't see that you could have been unmuted. You're welcome to unmute now and say your thank you or whatever you'd like to say if you wanted to respond to what Finn said. I don't know how. Ask to unmute. Oh, here you go.
Hello? Is this?
Yes,
Hi there.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, I was waiting so unsure just then. But yeah, thank you so much, Finn. Yeah, I'd love to just hear more and more. I wish your talk could go for long. I think you and your participants of such diverse ages as well have such a really valuable, you know, nuances to offer here. So yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your book when that comes out, hopefully soon.
Yes.
Down here, we can read it soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you. And yeah, I hope so. It's coming out. There it is there. It's called Female Masculinities and the Gender Wars. It's coming out in October from Bloomsbury. It's on the Bloomsbury website now. So yeah, I hope it will be available everywhere, but we'll wait and see. It's coming out in paperback as well.
Cool.
We have one more question that Ros has just put into the chat. So I'll have this as the question. But Ros is just saying, I wonder if there's space for young people to claim multiple identities, including lesbian, among more fluid identities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and lots of people said, look, that would be the ideal. And you know, people who expressed concern that they were getting assumed to be en route to a binary trans identity, those people generally, they all said, there wouldn't be a problem if I was going to a binary trans identity, and I don't have any problem with that, but they wanted to be seen for the identity that they were. So there wasn't hostility to other identities, and many people had mixed and matched. So people had come up with their own terms. So transgender butch, female man, queer butch, boy spelt B-O-I, you know, people had come up with their own terms. And it was interesting that although they had, as you saw in the slide about whether woman or lesbian is home, although they had issues kind of academically and politically with those terms, the majority said that they would still identify as a lesbian and as a woman. And they said that on forms or in monitoring forms, they felt that was a political act to do so, and they were determined to do it. Most people, you know, identified as a feminist. And one thing that came through that was sad for me in a way reading all of this was that they embraced and supported and strongly identified with feminism and as feminism, but in many ways they felt feminism did not love them back. And they had felt excluded along the line at different times and in different spaces. So yes, people were mixing and matching, they were maintaining identities, and a lot of people said, look, that would be the ideal. Let people mix and match. Let people move around. It's not in exclusion or degradation of other identities. It's just trying to find your own and have that respected as well.
I don't know if everyone can see that because it just went to the panelists, but Ros has just responded saying, thanks so much. That's fascinating. I would happily reclaim lesbian identity alongside being non-binary and queer, but transphobia in the lesbian community made me feel excluded. I appreciate your presentation so much.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's a really nice place to end the presentation. Thank you so much, Finn. So much of the things you touched on today in your presentation is so pertinent for a lot of the debates playing out here in Australia, in Victoria, and particularly at our research centre with a lot of the work that we do. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending and for all those really interesting questions. The next seminar is on the 16th of June, the 16th of June, and we've got Dr. Stephen Meldrum from the University of California talking about molecular HIV surveillance among in the US. So please join us for that if you like. But thanks, Finn. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I'll be in touch with you over email.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Great. And here's some nice comments. I can also send them to you if you like, Finn.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to read compliments.
Always.
Yeah. All right,
Right,
bye,
thank you very
everyone.
much. Bye-bye.